Welcome to Sounds of Resistance channel. The Ukrainian-Russian war is turning into a terrible torment for the Russians day by day. The Ukrainian army's operations that do not let the Russian units breathe caused quite striking revolts within the Russian army. This rebellion process, in which the Russian local people also participate, is melting Russia from the inside. While the Kremlin is shaking and the Russian regime is crumbling, the Russian people are trying every day to break the chains of Putin's egos for their future. The flame of the anger of the Russian people is so intense that it burns the Russian military buildings and administrative buildings and throws their commanders into that flame. These flames in the eyes of the Russian people feed on anger and pain and may soon spread to the Kremlin. The fiery chaos that started in Russia with the announcement of the leader Vladimir Putin's decision to mobilize was the most important operation that ignited the fuse. With the announcement of the mobilization decree by the leader Putin on Russian state television, Russian citizens were almost stuck on their television screens. There was dead silence in Russia for a while. Russian locals threw themselves into the streets, unsure of what to do. As soon as the mobilization decree, which was opposed by the overwhelming majority in Russia, was declared by Putin, the mobilization provisions went into implementation across the country. Russian leader Putin announced that with the mobilization decision, 300,000 Russian citizens will be voluntarily recruited to the Russian army. It was also approved by the Russian Defense Minister Shoigu that Russian citizens who do not meet the criteria for military service will not be included in the 300,000. But over time, these criteria were set aside, and the Russian Guard regiments rounded up whoever was on the streets of Russia and handed them over to the troops. As a result of the manhunt of the Russian Guard regiments, it was revealed that there were sick, elderly and disabled individuals among the citizens to be recruited into the Russian army. Disregarding concepts such as war crimes and human rights violations, the aim of the Russian administration was to find only 300,000 Russian volunteers. The expression volunteer used here was left behind as an adjective emphasizing only 300,000. Russian Defense Minister Shoigu made a statement that the erroneous actions of Russian citizens who do not meet the criteria for military service will be corrected. However, no adjustments were made in this regard. Against the declared mobilization throughout Russia, the Russian locals held dozens of protests. Russian citizens who found the practices of Vladimir Putin, the Kremlin administration and the Russian Defense Ministry to be very wrong filled the Moscow square. Russian citizens who filled the square in Moscow chanted slogans against the ongoing war in Ukraine and for the end of demobilization in Russia. But dictatorial leader Vladimir Putin detained 243 Russian citizens who participated in anti-mobilization protests in Moscow and many parts of Russia through the Russian police. It is known that Russian citizens who participated in the protest, where the Russian security forces were beaten with batons, were tortured in police stations. It has been announced that very serious criminal sanctions will be imposed on Russian citizens who participated in these protest demonstrations by opening a judicial trial. No individual in Russia can express their free thoughts in any way against its leader Putin anymore. Now we are going to peek of the uprisings in Russia. The most vocal example of the anti-mobilization actions announced throughout Russia occurred in the Siberian Ust-Ilimsk military registry office. A 25-year-old Russian teenager stormed the military registration office in Siberia, chanting anti-Ukraine Russian war slogans. The armed Russian young man, who did not allow the officers in the military registration office to intervene, pointed the barrel of his gun at a Russian military commissar and suddenly pulled the trigger. The Russian military commissar who was shot fell to the ground in blood. Then the armed Russian youth who carried out the rebellion said, "No one will go to war," with the words, "It's time to go home now." The Russian youth expressed his reaction to the mobilization decision announced by Putin throughout the country. It was stated that the life-threatening danger of the Russian military commissar who was shot in the armed action in the Siberian military registry office, which had an earthquake effect in the Russian media, continues. The armed Russian youth who carried out the action was caught by the military registration office officers and taken into custody. In Russia, things are getting seriously complicated. This mobilization decision announced by leader Putin influenced Russia so much that a day without incident began to pass in Russia. The anti-mobilization actions that spread to St. Petersburg also caused serious losses. In the past weeks, 54 Russian military enlistment offices in St. Petersburg and other Russian cities have been set on fire in the darkest hours of the night. The arson actions carried out simultaneously continued for days in Russia. Apart from the Russian military enlistment offices, many government buildings could not avoid surrendering to the fires. The fire events in Russia, which made a lot of noise, left the Kremlin administration quite helpless. The Kremlin administration, which could not reduce the tension of the Russian local people, tried to cover up the fires that took place in Russia and took place simultaneously at midnight. This escape policy, which the Russian leader also resorted to, no longer works in Russia. On the contrary, it makes Russian citizens more nervous. As a result of these events that took place in Russia, the Russian administration and leader Putin decided to make measures to prevent riots. Vladimir Putin started these preventive measures primarily from the Russian media. The Russian media, which has continued Putin's warmongering since the start of the Ukraine-Russia war, is still in Vladimir Putin's palm. Vladimir Putin, who brought serious restrictions to the media due to the war, put an end to all the free will of the Russian media. Moscow issued new directives to the media in late September after Russia announced a partial military mobilization to support its troops in Ukraine. Among the directives given to the Russian media by Putin's order, there are many remarkable rules. Under Putin's orders, Russian media outlets will only use data and information from federal and regional executive bodies when reporting mobilization efforts. Apart from this information, no statistical expression will be included. Only the term Russian military special operation will be used to describe the ongoing war in Ukraine. The word war will not appear in Russian media outlets, and also Russian media organizations that do not comply with all these rules will be fined $82,000. Staff in Russian media outlets who violate the rules for the second time will be sentenced to 15 years in prison. That's how free the media is in Russia. If you're aware, the systematic totalitarian system implemented by Russian leader Vladimir Putin has managed to intimidate not only the local people of Russia but also the media organizations in Russia. The government of fear, established by Russian leader, which has been going on since February 24, is still in power in the Ukrainian-Russian war, even though it is currently unsuccessful. The Russian leader did not only impose restrictions on media outlets, Putin continued to broadcast his blackmail policy against Europe through Russian media channels. Putin's political hypocrisy policies, which started with Nord Stream 1 and 2 pipeline problems, were presented in the Russian media as Vladimir Putin wanted. In this way, the Russian leader, trying to get an opportunity to change the course of the war, succeeded in destroying his reputation in the world political arena. Because Russia does not have the luxury of applying any economic sanctions, especially in this period, especially when it comes to Russia's most valuable and most profitable natural gas. As long as Putin's dirty political games continue, the plans of the Ukrainian army to save their country will become much easier. The same cannot be said for Russia. It may be too late for Russia, which has already entered its dark days. Do not forget to follow us to be informed about the developments. Thanks for watching.